When you picture a bee, you probably imagine it buzzing around flowers, not surviving a flood deep underground. But it turns out more than 80% of bee species, including many bumblebees, actually build their nest in the soil.
Wait, if they live in the ground, wouldn't their nests just flood whenever it rains heavily or snow melts?
Exactly, and that's a major threat during the winter. By late fall, most of a bumblebee colony dies off, leaving only the new queens to bury themselves in the dirt for a kind of insect hibernation called diapause.
So if the soil gets completely saturated while the queen is stuck sleeping down there, how does she keep from drowning?
Until very recently, scientists weren't completely sure, but a serendipitous discovery in 2024 showed these sleeping queens can survive completely submerged in water for up to an entire week.
A whole week? Are they just holding their breath that entire time?
That's what makes a newly published study so exciting, because researchers found out the queens are actually breathing underwater.
That sounds incredible, but is it really that unusual for an insect to breathe underwater?
For aquatic bugs like diving beetles, it's totally normal, but bumblebees are strictly land dwellers. As experts have pointed out, seeing a terrestrial insect pull off this underwater survival trick is a completely unexpected finding. Sometimes the most fascinating scientific breakthroughs happen completely by mistake. A few years ago, conservation biologist Sabrina Rondo was keeping hibernating bumblebee queens in a lab fridge to study pesticide effects.
Wait, she was keeping live bees in a refrigerator?
Exactly, because it safely simulates the winter conditions they experience during a hibernation phase called diapause. But one day, she opened the fridge and found that condensation had completely flooded some of the tubes, submerging the queens.
Oh no, I'm assuming that was the end of the line for those bees.
Rondeau thought so too, but to her absolute shock, the bees started moving shortly after she pulled them out of the water. She wondered if this unexpected survival was just a crazy fluke, so she decided to test it on purpose.
Did she just intentionally flood more tubes?
Yes, she submerged over 100 queens for up to a full week and then let them recover and dry soil in the fridge. Remarkably, about 90% of those submerged bees survived.
That is wild. But do they have any idea how a bee could survive a week underwater?
That is what they need to figure out next. So Rondo teamed up with Charles Darvieux, an ecological physiologist at the University of Ottawa. Their main working hypothesis right now is that these sleeping queens might actually be breathing underwater. Let's look at how insects manage to survive when they end up completely submerged in water. Normally, terrestrial insects just hold their breath and survive without oxygen, while aquatic insects can actually extract oxygen directly from the water.
Since bumblebees are land dwellers, I assume they rely on holding their breath?
That's what you normally expect, but researcher Joel Darvieux suspected bumblebee queens might actually be using the aquatic strategy. To test this, his team placed 51 queens in a hibernation state called diapause and submerged them in water for a full 8 days.
8 days underwater sounds impossible for a bee. How did the researchers figure out what survival strategy they were using?
They analyzed the water at the end of those 8 days and found the oxygen concentration was 40% lower in the tubes holding the bees. They also found a consistent production of carbon dioxide.
So the bees were actively pulling oxygen out of the water and exhaling carbon dioxide the whole time?
Exactly. They were genuinely breathing underwater. This is the very first time a terrestrial insect like a bumblebee has been shown to extract oxygen out of water.
That's amazing. But how can a bee possibly get enough oxygen from water to survive?
The secret is diapause, which slows the queen's metabolic rate to just 5% of its normal resting value. Because her body is running so slowly, her oxygen needs plummet, making it much easier to breathe while completely submerged. It turns out that making it through a flood isn't just about relying on one trick, but actually combining multiple biological strategies. For these hibernating bumblebee queens, researchers discovered that breathing underwater is only half the story because they also use anaerobic metabolism.
Anaerobic metabolism. So they are basically shifting to generate energy without using any oxygen.
Exactly. And researchers proved this by tracking the bees' carbon dioxide levels right after taking them out of the water. Their CO2 production spiked dramatically, more than tenfold, before gradually returning to normal over 7 days.
Why would their carbon dioxide levels suddenly spike after they are already back out in the air?
It's a recovery response, very similar to how you might breathe heavily right after an intense sprint. We breathe harder to process waste products from that oxygen-free burst of energy, and that heavy breathing releases a massive amount of carbon dioxide.
That makes a lot of sense. Did the researchers look for those chemical waste products directly inside the bees?
They did, specifically testing for a byproduct called lactate by freezing groups of queens at different stages and grinding them into a mush. They found that lactate levels more than doubled while the bees were submerged.
So that definitely confirms they were using oxygen-free energy while they were trapped underwater.
It does, but those lactate levels still weren't nearly high enough to explain their survival if they had been relying solely on anaerobic energy. It proves that the true key to their survival is the fascinating combination of both underwater breathing and anaerobic metabolism working together.
With the survival of these underwater bumblebees confirmed, scientists are eager to figure out exactly how they pull this off. One major theory is that the bees use a physical gill, which is an air bubble trapped against their bodies like a tiny scuba tank.
That sounds amazing. But with all that fuzz on a bumblebee, wouldn't an air bubble be really hard to actually see?
It definitely is, since the air layer gets hidden right under their thick hair. To prove it is there, future experiments might use something like a detergent to break up those bubbles and see how it affects the bees' breathing.
Oh, that is a clever way to test it. Do they think this scuba trick is unique to just this one type of bumblebee?
Researchers guess that other bee species might share this ability, but it is still a huge unanswered question. They also need to find out the limits of the survival trick, like how many flood cycles the queens can handle before it causes long-term harm.
It seems like figuring that out would be pretty important for protecting their populations.
Exactly. And it brings up a major blind spot in how we think about bumblebee conservation. We usually just focus on providing flowers for them to forage in the spring and summer, but this shows we urgently need to consider what habitat conditions they need to survive the winter.